let's talk about trade. And in the areas of trade, as all over the world, a very important part of how adjacent civilizations and cultures and towns and cities and villages interact with each other. Remember, we're talking populations of ever increasing populations, settling it at 100 million and possibly as high as 150 million, although there's still low counters out there as well too. So a fair number of people inhabiting these two continents. The trade routes were quite pronounced. They were paths, of course. A lot of the trade routes were rivers at that point, and those were really the main tributaries, the roadways of these types of civilizations in many ways were the rivers, but of course there was a lot of paths as well too. Now, the trade routes had a lot to do with the disease factor later, because the trade routes were very old. They were thousands and thousands of years old. They were very well used. There was a very intricate set of the trade routes, and the disease spread inland very, very quickly on these trade routes. They did a lot of trading. Now the trails that covered, let's take North America, for instance, where we think more about the trails in the woods, but they had road systems and trails all through the Mesoamerica and South America, as you're going to hear about the amazing Royal Road. But these trail systems, they then became the roadways after colonialism. They stayed as trails, and then they become more complex trails and more complex, and those are the highway systems of today. So a lot of people don't realize when you look at the highway systems, the interstates and the main roadways and arteries in North America today, it's all the old Indian trails, and there's an entire history involved just with that aspect of things. And that stands to reason that a lot of the history and the heritage is gone, paved over with highways, just like the main areas. If you look at New York and Manhattan, Chicago, in Canada, Quebec, Montreal, Toronto, there's a reason why those are the big cities. They were the best spots. And they were towns before. They were good-sized towns and cities before that, many of these places. And that's why a lot of these became the trails, the cities. They were taken up where the indigenous left off, and the colonial people came in and took over these areas. Manhattan, which of course the old story that we all grew up with about that Manhattan, and it's another justification. It was a permission to farm on Manhattan, and that's all that was given at that point. But anyway, Broadway. We all know Broadway. That was an Indian trail. That was the main Indian trail, and there was plenty of people there. That was the main Indian trail that went up and down through Manhattan at that time. The name Manhattan is an indigenous name, comes from an indigenous name. It's been hacked, of course. Doesn't sound much like that. So corn grew all over the place in North and Meso and South America. It was developed in Mesoamerica, one of the first foods in the world, the only food in the world that is not trackable back to its wild plant that it was inherited from. But that's a good example, because corn grows as far north as possible and as far south as possible, and all over those two continents. And just like the first metal workers in the world were copper workers from around the Great Lakes, and their goods have been found as far as the Pacific coast. So the trade routes were well traversed, and they were well known, and they were abundant. Okay, see you next time.